So we've talked a little bit about the nature of change, about how if we go through that never-ending cycle of change that quite often begins with a bit of fear and leads into a bit of loss and sadness, and eventually we adapt, come to a place of stillness, which then leads us to a kind of question of what can we contribute, what can we do? And then we also talked a bit about what happens when change gets difficult, when it's hard, and how sometimes telling stories is a way in which communities begin to find a sense of identity through difficult times. They begin to make sense of the journey that they've been through, the different places they've come from, and how they share a common humanity. And then just finally, I'd like to talk about what's in it for us. So when change happens, when change is really difficult, what are the kind of changes that people describe, the kind of growth that comes from people as a result of these kind of changes? So if you think clinically speaking, quite often we talk about change as an interruption, so we're piddling along a certain level of well-being, and then suddenly something difficult occurs. There's a challenge, there's a hardship, there's a frustration, there's a block that comes our way. And sometimes that knocks us off for a while. It knocks us out of our functioning. So we go from functioning like this to functioning down here. And at that point, there's only a few options available for us. So either we put up with the fact that we're just not going to function very well again. So sometimes when you see people who succumb to a long-term depression, sometimes that's what's happened to them in terms of they went through some change. Sometimes the change can even be relatively minor. Sometimes it's a big one as well. And then they function at a lower level after that, in terms of it's almost like they kind of feel numb, feel like they've got nothing left to give, feel like they can't do what they used to do. For some people, the moment of change is a moment to sort of climb back up the hill, back up the mountain to restoring where they once were before. You'll hear people say things like, before I moved here, before this happened, I was happy-go-lucky, I was absolutely fine. And now I'm this, and it's them trying to say, I just want to get back to where I was before. And in clinical terms, we'd call that recovery. But then there's another finding in clinical work that isn't just sort of surviving, it isn't just recovery, getting back to where we came from, but you could call it thriving. Thriving is when we take difficult things that have happened to us, and having gone through the grief and the pain and the difficulty of them, we use them as a springboard into something better. Some people would call this is what they call post-traumatic growth or adversarial growth, the way in which we make lemonade out of lemons, the way in which we take the bad things in life and instead of allowing them to make us bitter, we use them to make us better. And quite a large proportion of people who go through difficult times will describe this kind of growth as a result. And one of the reasons this is quite interesting for you guys in terms of thinking about communities and community living and things like that is because this is one way of beginning to think about what are the opportunities for growth that may occur when a whole new community gets born. What are the possibilities that might be there? So psychologists have talked about a few of them, but there's sort of three main areas in which people seem to have the opportunity to grow when they go through a difficult time. The first one is the self. So thinking about how your sense of self grows. So some people who've been through a difficult time will say, well, I used to feel like I was a victim or that life just happened to me, but now actually I view myself kind of like a survivor. You know, I've come through a heck of a lot. There was a novelist who said a few years back that damaged people are dangerous because they know they can survive anything. That's one of the things that can come to us when we go through change. We think, I'm a survivor now, I've made it, I've got through. Another thing that occurs to us through change around the self is self-reliance. So we can feel like, actually, I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned that I can stand on my own 2 feet, that there are situations that were challenging. I might have wanted to run away from them in the past, but actually I've learned, no, I can cope with them. So self-reliance is one of them. And also many people in terms of their perceptions of their self will say that as a result of change, they begin to think about themselves in new ways, particularly around notions of strength and vulnerability. So whereas previously they may have felt that they had to be strong and rigid and never weak and those kind of things, as a result of change, sometimes what we discover is that the best form of strength is a flexible form of strength. that vulnerability isn't weakness. In fact, vulnerability is the flex that allows us to go with the currents and the winds of life in a way that's really functional and quite good. So change can bring alterations to the self. It can bring growth to the self. Change can also influence relationships. So sometimes when change comes our way, it can be a moment of really beginning to think about various other things. So some people will talk about this is the moment where they find compassion for other people. It's the moment when they start to say, actually, you know what? Other people are like me. Perhaps people who previously looked at other people who were sick or weaker than them in some way, or maybe had a sort of lower status than them in society on some level, when they go through hard times, suddenly they find themselves being compassionate and interested and caring. We've seen this recently in Manchester, in the attacks there, where suddenly in response to this very difficult situation, there's enormous compassion and empathy begins to come across the city, this sense of we're in this together, our relationships are improved. So change can help us change our sense of self, it can help us grow in our relationships, it can also help us grow in our philosophy of life. So some people get quite philosophical in response to change or difficulty that they go through. So some people will say, I'm wiser as a result of what's happened. I've learned a few things about myself, about the world. It's not unusual to hear people as they get older say things like, I'm sadder, but I'm wiser. It's like, I look at life, I've got no illusions left, I've got nothing left to prove, but I've still got a heck of a lot left to learn, to look at life and to really know how to live it. For some people, it'd be the moment that they start asking existential questions about life. What's the meaning? What should I give myself to? What am I committed to? Has the way I've lived my life so far really added up to a lot? Is this the way I want to carry on? I was hearing the other day about an academic, not at this university, a different university, who went through a heart attack. So had a heart attack, survived it, and then afterwards started re-evaluating all kinds of parts of his life. And one of the decisions he made after that was, he said, basically, it's time to change my priorities. From now on, I will spend more time with my family, more time on my research, and I will never, ever go to another departmental meeting ever again. It was just one of those moments where he was saying, my priorities have altered as a result of the changes that have been going on. And for some people, their life philosophy alters because they discover spirituality. It becomes the moment in which they say, actually, there might be something deeper in life that's really worth living for. So it's not unusual following changes and difficulties that that's the moment where people feel that their relationship to the divine or something more ultimate or something bigger than themselves actually increases, and they start on a kind of quest to find out what all that's about too. So change can bring about all kinds of different alterations, different areas of growth in ourself, in our relationship to other people, and also in our general way of relating to life, our general philosophy. So those are the three things I wanted to talk to you about. Firstly, how change works, that we're always in change, that change is occurring all the time in life, and we kind of have to roll with it. That's just the way things are. And then secondly, talking a bit about what makes change difficult. Those moments where change is difficult to compute, it requires us to kind of make meaning of it, find a kind of story to tell that makes sense of the path that we've journeyed along. And then thirdly, talking about how actually change can help us grow. When we go through difficult times or stressful changes, that can be the moment where either in the way we view ourselves or in the way we relate to other people or in the way in which we kind of construct our philosophy of life, that those things can be different too. So thank you so much for listening. I hope those ideas have been useful for you, and I really look forward to hearing how you get on in discussing them and how the rest of the day's gone. Thanks very much.